Quick note, this video is dealing with a topic I do not feel is suited for children. This video deals with an adult subject and some things just could not be avoided. Please watch this independently from your children and then decide later if they're able to watch. Many of them in their teens definitely need to see this so it can counteract the culture, but only you know your child and what they've been exposed to. So please take that into consideration before watching this with your family. Also, if you're overly sensitive and have not been affected by the sexualization of our culture, then please do not watch this as well. We have some things to talk about. Be blessed, family. One of the biggest trends today in our modern entertainment culture are origin stories. The filmmakers love to go back and show the history of how a character came to be. It's most often done with the villain or a vigilante. It provides the audience with understanding of how this main character could grow to become so wicked or evil. We have to be careful when we watch those type of movies and shows because they're very often tools that are about getting the audience to understand, rationalize, and even tolerate evil. The irony with this trend of origin stories is that while our entertainment loves to do this in regards to fictional characters, or even in some documentaries telling us of the history of actual people, there is no real origin story of how we as a society have gotten to the point in time that we are at today. For most people, unfortunately not the younger generation, but for those of my generation and older, I'm an early 80s baby. For my generation and older, those of us with our eyes opened, it's hard to deny that the times that we're in today are the most wicked times in history. What was once good is now evil, and vice versa. What was once evil is now deemed to be good. We see clearly what this world is like today. The devil's influence is very easily seen within our culture. And so today when we look at these youngins, we look at them as if they are what's wrong in this world. But as adults, what each of us have to do is own the problem and our contribution to it. It's not just the younger generation at fault. They are just the inevitable consequence and result of our actions. As a father of all boys, I had to recognize that early and look at the culture that I was raising my sons under and recognize that if I did not want my sons to be like this, I myself could not be like this. I had to go backwards and analyze all of my thoughts. I was able to go back to hip-hop culture and recognize how all of the mindsets I grew up under affected the type of man I grew to be. I saw and recognized how hip-hop culture poisoned me and most of the people I grew up with and around. And from that realization, there was change in my life. But besides that realization, there were still many things about hip-hop I didn't really understand, and many things I blame my parents for. Not that I was an easy child to raise, but there were certain mindsets that they had that definitely affected me, but I didn't understand how they got there. Over the past few weeks, we have been going over the history of our mind control. In the last episode of this series, we covered the 1960s. The 60s is very easily seen as the decade that brought about movements of change in our modern society. We saw political and social change that would not have been possible without the influence of the television. But while the 60s was a period of change, it still does not fully give the answer of how we got to the point we are at today. The decade of the 60s marks the point in time of change, and there are other influences that we need to highlight within that decade, from movies to music, because all these things were major tools that accompany the influence from the television. We need to go over it all. And what we need right now is an origin story of how we let society become so evil and how we let evil pervade our society. And if you want to do this, there's no better decade to start in this story than the 1970s. To me, it seems that this decade is very much overlooked and forgotten. Being an 80s baby, I obviously have no recollection of these times, obviously. But if we as students of history try to go back and learn from our past and the mistakes we as a society have made, this forgotten decade cannot be overlooked. The 70s by far is the decade when Satan comes out into the light from the darkness and intentionally invades our culture, and we have never been the same since. The most noticeable and influential change is the sexualization of our culture. Today we live in a culture where sexual content and sexual themes is just a natural part of the culture. Sex is a part of our lives. It pretty much goes without saying now. If you happen to scroll through social media, our young men and our young women talk about sex without care or shame. People make reels about sexual encounters and topics that a few decades ago would have been completely improper and only a few rebels would talk and be vocal about. Because things are so bad, we just look at this culture and just assume that it's always been like this. I mean, our children definitely do. But it's important to understand that the sexualization of our culture was not by accident. It was due to mental conditioning that was only able to gain an influential dominance because of the television. As we continue to discuss the history of our mind control, I know many of us want to just skip over to the 80s and the 90s where there were major shifts. But if we do not deal with the 70s, just as I had questions about my childhood and how certain things were present and certain mindsets were able to be had, if we skip the 70s, we will miss the answer to these questions. The 1970s was the decade that our society lost its morality. And if we want to shake off these chains of satanic influence, it's important that we look back at the origin story of how evil came into our society so we can clearly see the point at which we must reverse and correct. We're going to discuss the mind control of the 70s that led us to losing our morality and when the sexualization of our culture truly began to grow in influence. Let's begin. So as we begin to discuss the 70s, it's important to understand the main theme of that decade. As I researched this time period, I think it can be summed up by one word. That word is rebellion. As I explained in the other parts of this series, the main group that was first affected by this mind control was the baby boomers. Now, it's important to note and understand that in the culture of change that they were growing up under, their rebellion was not directly targeted at the Most High, though this is precisely who they were rebelling against. They actually were rebelling against the values of their parents and their government, though. You see, the 70s was in the midst of the civil rights and anti-war movements, both different movements, and they created different mindsets between the baby boomer generation and their parents. The younger generation of the 1960s questioned authority and rejected their parents' values. They protested the war in Vietnam, and there was a hippie culture that was created. In the 1960s and 70s, the hippies were a countercultural movement that rejected the mores of mainstream American life. They rejected materialism. Hippies were largely a white middle-class group of teenagers and 20-somethings who belonged to the baby boomer generation. They felt alienated from middle-class society, which they saw as being dominated by materialism and repression. So they developed their own distinctive lifestyle. These baby boomers protested the way of life of their parents and created a new culture of tolerance. They promoted openness and tolerance as alternatives to the restrictions that they saw in middle-class society. Hippies often practiced open sexual relationships and lived in various types of family groups. They commonly sought spiritual guidance from sources outside the Judeo-Christian tradition, particularly with Buddhism, Hinduism, and other Eastern religions. They promoted the recreational use of hallucinogenic drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD. Now, this movement, it was not a long one in regards to society. It pretty much died out by the mid-70s. And by the 1980s, hippies had given way to a new generation of young people who are intent on making careers for themselves in business. Basically, after they had a family, they had another tune. The television show Family Ties, it depicts this.
We're going out to demonstrate against nuclear arms. There's nothing foolish about that.
I don't think this is very useful now.
It wasn't that useful then.
But the thing that must be understood is that this counterculture was the basis for change. They basically said whatever way our parents were raised under, we no longer accept. And they introduced alternative lifestyles in a way that, though it was not followed by all, it came to be a major unseen influence that we are still affected by today. It was a culture of rebellion, and many different subcultures later brought their own spin to it. The hippie culture brought tolerance of rebellion in the baby boomer generation, and it created a whole new mindset. We all may have heard of and know of hippies, but here's what I think we don't know. This culture that they had was not new. They did not invent it in the 60s and the 70s. It was just something that was broadcasted and made popular through different mediums, from the movies, definitely the music, but without question, the television. The hippies' origins can be traced back to European social movements in the 19th and early 20th century with groups such as Bohemians. Hippies started to really grow in influence after the start of the Vietnam War, which they protested against very much, being that there was a draft. They began protesting the United States military involvement in Vietnam, and these protesters received the label of being a part of the hippie movement. They were a result of the mind control programs of the 60s that I spoke about in parts 2 and 3. A number of them have been highly active in the civil rights movement in the first half of the 1960s. They were the ones traveling across the country, taking part in sit-ins and marches against segregation in the South. As the 60s rolled on, so did their influence. By the early 70s, much of hippie style had been integrated into mainstream American society. Large rock concerts that originated with the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival and the 1968 Isle of Wight Festival became the norm. There was a whole culture that they introduced, and rather than focusing on the exacts of that culture, the understanding that's easier had is that they were just a counterculture. They were there to express that you didn't have to follow the rules and you can do things the way you wanted. This was actually satanic culture of do what thou wilt, but it definitely was not seen in this way at that time. But you see, once you open the doors of rebellion, unless there is a strong movement against it, there's no going backwards, and there was not. There was a culture that rebelled on social norms, and today, it might not make a lot of sense considering how immoral we are right now, but during this time period, they represented mass change. The change wasn't more about being a certain way, more than it was about tolerance of being however you wanted to be. This influence was subtle but powerful. For example, when I went to school in the 80s and 90s, the gender identities and homosexual influence, it was not tolerated at all. Now, in this younger generation, they grow up around all this culture that seems normal. And though many of them don't share those values, they tolerate others having them, and it's their tolerance that has brought about massive change in what society accepts. It was the same way back then, just not as targeted and defined as today. It wasn't that everyone agreed with each other, it was just about tolerance of being different. It was basically make love, not war. And this mentality produced and spread a mindset of acceptance of a gradual change in our values that has never stopped and only become stronger and more dramatic. All the current ways of life and changes in our values that we know of today started because of the movements in the 70s. So let me just say this before we continue. Over the past few episodes of this Mind Control series, I've taken some slack from many on two main points. One point was my lack of respect for Michael King, whom many know as Martin Luther King Jr. People feel that I should use the name that his daddy changed it to in order to continue with the mind control that the public currently holds. Now, in regards to Michael King, I unapologetically will tell you I do not care. I do not respect wolves. The same way many of you hate Trump and have these feelings that you cannot shake is the exact same feeling I have for King and all the other sellouts, but specifically Michael, because of the stronghold he has put Yah's children in. I do not respect him, so you are right if that is what you feel you're hearing. You see, this is truth unedited. I'm not editing the truth to make it more digestible. I'm using his real name to wipe out the mind control. But whatever. Let's talk about the second one. The second part of the criticism I am receiving was expected, and this is mostly from women who do not like my views on the feminist movement. I get these comments often that they feel that they're not feminists and they don't agree with feminism, but then they hypocritically argue feminist ideals and believe I'm not being fair and I'm not equally shifting the blame. This feedback does not come from all, obviously. Now, for this part of the dialogue, I am apologetic on, because I sincerely am not trying to promote an idea of shifting blame on women only. I do not believe that women are the only ones to blame, and I do not put the blame solely on them for the destruction of our families. I absolutely blame men, and if you knew me personally and how I raise my sons, you would understand that. Men are always the problem because it rises and falls on leadership. And being that men are supposed to be the leaders of our families, a long time ago they gave into challenges and eventually failed us. This goes back to weak Adam letting his women lead him into rebellion. If our men were what they were supposed to be, then these movements would not have been possible. I feel this tremendously. But let me say that while I do have harsh critique on the men, it was not a destroy men movement. The men did not stand up and protest and say they wanted to be weak men. That's not what happened. It was not a conscious choice or decision that made them fail, but many of them by circumstances, particularly in Negro culture. This is not a justification, but it's just putting things in proper perspective. The truth is, our men need to learn how to be men and learn what that is. This is absolutely true. But what I was highlighting in these videos was a conscious decision by women to walk in rebellion of the Most High and His ways in order to obtain this world. Do you remember the story of Eve and Satan in the garden? Once Eve took that bite from Satan, it was a wrap. And women of Yah, please understand, this is the only audience I'm speaking to, those who want to serve the Most High. It is important to understand how Satan came back to y'all with a different fruit of rebellion. The feminist movement was by choice. It is a decision to have this mindset, and I was just highlighting it. Just as much as men don't know how they have been influenced to be the way they are, the women are the same, and highlighting the feminist movement that started in the 60s can help illustrate just how we got to where we are now. These were movements. I did not start them. I'm just illustrating the effects of them. Now, in reviewing our culture and society, there are a few statistics that help define how far society has gone. The statistic I like to focus on are marriage statistics, because if we follow the marriage trends, it's easy to see the changes that happen in society. So before I review the 70s, I think it's important that rather than go over the culture of the people before the 70s, it would help if I went over the statistics. These stats are from the United States Census Bureau. Let's look at this chart first. This chart tracks the median age people had their first marriage. This is from the year 1890 to 2010. Now, we're not going to deal with the later decades from the 90s onward, but we will deal with the world after World War II, when the United States started to come into its own. In the 1950s, men were mostly getting married at the age of 24. And we can see that that was pretty constant through to 1970, a time period of about 20 years. But by the end of the 70s, the trend started to change and men started getting married at 25. Not a huge difference, but still a difference. The difference, as we can see, is with the women. In 1950, the median age of women first getting married was at 20 and a half years old. By 1970, it went to 22. And by the 80s, it jumped to 23 and a half. If you look over 30 years, women started getting married much later. And listen, this chart, it doesn't even tell the full picture because it shows just men and women in the United States as a whole. But this chart tells a slightly more detailed story by separating it not only by sex, but by race. And we see that before the 1950s, black men were getting married at a younger age than white men. But by the 1980s, where the other chart showed men getting married by the age of 25, black men were getting married at the age of 26. And the trend with black women was even more dramatic. Black women were getting married at younger ages than any demographic. But by the 1950s, black and white women were getting married around the same age. But over the 20 years to 1970, the trend for black women had a more dramatic trend up. And by the 1980s, black women were getting married around the same age as black men were, which was over 25. You see, over 30 years, they started getting married 5 years later than before. This was a dramatic difference in the creation of the family unit. According to the United States Census Bureau, from 1890 to 1950, the median age at first marriage for black men was lower than for white men. Since 1960, the median age at first marriage has been higher for black men than for white men. And by 2010, the median age at first marriage was 30.7 for black men and 27.8 for white men. That's a big difference. Let's look at the women. From 1890 through 1940, black women had a lower median age at first marriage than white women. After 1950, the median age at first marriage for black women was higher than for white women. By 2010, the median age at first marriage for black women was 30 years, while white women were at 26.4. White families were having a 4-year head start on getting started than black families. Here's more stats. The percentage of those aged 35 and older who were never married was higher from 1890 through 1930 for white men than black men. But by 1960, this reversed, with black men aged 35 and over having a higher percentage never married. Black women were more likely to have been married by age 35 than their white counterparts until 1970. By 2010, the percent never married for 35 and over with black women was 25%, and white women 8%. When you look at these statistics, do you think that this was by accident? You see, I could go over statistic after statistic to prove my point. The fact is that there was a dramatic change in society during the decades following the 1950s. Now, we went over some of the change from the 1960s in the other videos, but there is obviously a lot more to discuss. The common view that people want to have today in regards to marriage is that the culture of the Negro in America is against marriage. But the statistics do not lie, because before civil rights and the call to be equal in American society, Negroes in America were getting married at higher percentages at younger ages. So be clear, it isn't that Negroes are against marriage, but the institution of marriage was attacked, and there was a mindset shift that was drawn away from the family unit over to the individual person. People cared more about themselves and their careers than they cared about starting families and building their communities. And the most ironic and hypocritical thing is that it is known that marriage and economic stability are extremely linked. So while the Negroes were protesting to be equal and have the same economic opportunities, they were attaching themselves to a culture that reduced their power and economic strength. The same economy that they wanted to be equal in, they mentally started to take on mindsets that reduced their strength. So now it was not only the man holding them back, more than their own mentality. By and large, a married couple does better than single individuals. So if that's the case, how did all of this come to be? It's simple. There was a cultural shift, and this was seen in the 70s. So this is where we'll start. The 70s was a period of introduction to immorality in the mainstream. I want to be clear that it wasn't like immorality was not present in American society before the 50s. Absolutely not. That's not the case. We are talking about a nation that started its history off the back of slavery. They called it the land of the free while having slaves build its infrastructure. The hypocrisy has always been present in this land from its establishment. But in regards to immoral values, the masses believed that they were Christians holding on to Christian values, so many of their sins were not carried out in the public and in the mainstream.
There are words men live by, words of strength, of wisdom, and of peace. We urge you to find the spiritual comfort and guidance we all so greatly need by attending your place of worship regularly.
Immorality was something more secretive, done in the dark. Now, before the 70s, sexual influence was definitely in society. The movie stars were women, and they were looked at as sexual objects by men. Hugh Hefner already had started Playboy magazine. What I am saying is that the sexualization of women did not start in the 70s, but it was not mainstream. It was more secretive, even though it was in the culture.
Sort of cools the ankles, doesn't it? What do you think would be fun to do now? Cut!
If you remember shows like I Love Lucy, originally aired from 1951 to 1957, Lucy and Desi had to sleep in separate beds. Although Lucy and Desi were married in real life, they were still not allowed to share a bed in the show's 6 seasons. At the time, married couples sharing a bed was considered much more scandalous than it is today. They had separate beds with their own tucked-in blankets. Much of this was because it was a less risque time. There was less tolerance to this. What I'm saying is that though the influence was there, it was still not tolerated by the masses yet. But the sexual revolution that was started in the 60s really gained steam and influence in the 70s. You've seen in part 3 we spoke about the feminist movement of the 60s. But right along with the feminist movement was the sexual revolution. Now it appears that feminists try to differentiate their movement from the sexual revolution. But to men, they were almost the same thing.
You talk about the sexual revolution, if you want to call it that. It was kind of shocking to me that all these things were going on, because my time of day, this was unheard of. You know, you didn't talk about these things. Like, I used to kid around. I say I was 22 years old before I found out a prophylactic wasn't a toothbrush. And, you know, we knew, but not like the kids were practicing what we knew, so to speak.
I think that in discussing the 70s, this is where we must start. As I explained in part 3, the crux of the feminist movement was women demanding that they be equals in the workforce. And with the distribution of birth control, it gave women more control over their lives and when they chose to have children. They were planning parenthood. Women wanted to be equal with men in society instead of being the helpmate that Yah designed them to be. For those that care what the Bible says, Genesis chapter 2 says, "And Yahuwah Elohim said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." That's Genesis chapter 2 verse 18. Verse 20 says, "So Adam gave names to all cattle, to the birds of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper comparable to him." And lastly, "And Yahuwah Elohim caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which Yahuwah Elohim had taken from man, he made into woman, and he brought her to the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." That's Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 through 25. And this is why women were created, not to be made as equals with men, but as their helpers. And regardless of at this present time you disagree with these roles of the past, it is undeniable that this was the way the world has been for millennia, thousands of years. They were even like this, though, in the 50s. These views against this did not occur until the rise and influence of the feminist women led by atheists and Satanists. This is just another reason why the Bible is being looked at as hate speech and a way of outdated thinking. It is believed that this view is a way of being unjust to women and keeping them down, when in fact it is the way that we were all created, and when in those natural roles, families thrive and grow in strength. But let's stay focused on what was going on in the 70s. The sexual revolution was a big deal. At the core of this revolution was the concept, and mind you that this concept is now pretty much accepted as the normal way of thought in this world today. But before the 70s, it was actually pretty radical. The concept was that women, just like men, enjoyed sex and had sexual needs. Feminists asserted that single women had the same sexual desires and should have the same sexual freedoms as everyone else in society. For feminists, the sexual revolution was about female sexual empowerment. You see, here's the danger. And I'm not shifting blame, I'm just calling it how it is. Men love women, obviously. But think about it. When women had values that they needed to be married first, what did men do? They married them. And women looked down at the loose women in a great way. But now that women say that they don't need to be attached to a man in order to have sexual relationships, there was no longer any boundary that a man had to worry about. Now the one thing that was exclusively special about a woman is given out like candy at a candy store. This was not the way things were supposed to be. I'm sorry to tell you. And this is not about whether men are right or women are right. I'm just saying that when women held out, they got more from the man. And let me explain this in another way. This was not a problem started by women either. But it was, however, an easy to foresee reaction to the immorality of men. You see, in the 1950s, Hugh Hefner came out with his Playboy magazine, a magazine which aimed to target males between the ages of 21 and 45. The cover page and nude centerfold in the first edition featured Marilyn Monroe, then a rising sex symbol. We had sex symbols. From the 1950s to the early 70s, Playboy's circulation, including subscription and newsstand sales, and advertising revenues steadily increased, reaching a high point of 7.2 million copies sold in November of 1972, and average sales of 5.6 million copies per issue in 1975. The Playboy philosophy, articulated by Hefner himself in the pages of the magazine, it advocated complete personal freedom for both men and women in all things, including sex. Hefner always said he was champion of women's liberation in the feminist movement, actually.
But in terms of my attitude on the whole, the feminist movement as it exists now, I think that women over generations and centuries have indeed been oppressed. I think there's no question about it.
That legally and culturally, that our society and much of the Western world, and apparently, at least to the same degree, the eastern part of the world as well, is still suffering from really deep-seated sexual repression, and we are still a long ways from throwing off the chains of sexual superstition and bondage.
Through Playboy's support of that belief and its popularization of the notion that viewing sexually suggestive photography of women was not only acceptable but healthy. It was this major influence amongst many others that led to there being a double standard that society decided needed to be rectified. You see, they created a double standard, and women later decided that they had the right to be the same way. And this was what the sexual revolution was about.
This gossip about a nude fold-out in Cosmopolitan magazine.
Well, I think if you talk about it, it probably spoils some of the fun. And I wish the whole thing had never been brought up publicly, because then, you know, I could just spring it on everybody and people would say, my word, have you seen Cosmopolitan this month? They've got a naked man in there. And now there's been so much talk about it that I feel it's going to be anticlimactic when it finally happens. Well, a naked man, we wouldn't show everything. He'd be in a nice, decent pose of some kind behind a flower pot or something. But, you see, I think that in a few years, maybe even sooner than that, women are going to enjoy looking at men's naked bodies as much as men enjoy looking at women's naked bodies.
Now, wait, that's a very peculiar thing to say. Why would they?
Because you're beautiful. Why wouldn't you, for heaven's sake?
If men controlled it and did not bring all that sexual immorality out in the open, women would not felt that they needed to be justified in having the same thoughts. See, it was a men's problem that started this. You will see that as American society kept pushing boundaries, the argument was never should they ever stop this, but the argument was more about not excluding other groups to take part in it. The sexual revolution was the first major step in bringing satanic thought out into the open, and they used the feminist movement to justify it. And the thing that people need to see is that it all goes back to Michael King and the civil rights agenda.
Take issue and separate in this one rather fundamental area. There is usually a parallel made between female emancipation and racial equality. And I don't think it's the same thing, even though the feminist movement grew out of the civil rights, the current feminist movement grew out of the civil rights business.
You see, they used the oppression of the Negroes to justify equality for all, which then gave credibility to the feminist movement, which then was later expanded into the sexual revolution of the 70s. Our immorality was brought out into the mainstream because of the demand to be equal. So yeah, there was the sexual revolution, and it was really brought out into the mainstream in the 70s. It is said that back then, when someone would ask a woman if they were liberated, it actually meant, do you have sex? And if a man actually said it, it meant, will you have sex with me? The sexual revolution was all about getting rid of the double standard that women were supposed to be virgins.
Well, growing up in the 50s, it was a pretty, those were the quiet years, and the expectations were not great for young women of my age or my era or my neighborhood. I grew up in a working class neighborhood where there wasn't a lot of expected of you other than to be a good girl. You did not have sex before marriage. You were expected to be a virgin when you married. So many girls married young and had children by the age of 20. As I left high school, I thought the most important thing for me was not college. I tried it. I thought it would be great, but I picked something that was very traditionally a woman, kind of a job, a secretary, confidential secretary, thinking that was very cool, but was more interested in getting married and being with my boyfriend. I mean, that was just, I had to be with him. So that was where I was at. I think I did accept the premise of the 50s. I think where I began to become uncomfortable was when I became a mom. And that's when I started moving into the 60s, where I saw that there were other options for me. There was always this inner struggle for me to do something else with my life besides just being a mom. Not that I didn't find that of value. I did. No, I did. And I felt very strongly that I should be home with my children, and I was, that was my job. I would not think of having a day treatment, a daycare program for my children. I would not think of having a babysitter. That was my job. Or someone from the extended family. Absolutely not. But when I moved into the 60s, I started thinking, I've got to do something. Maybe a part-time job was what I wanted to do. I did that for a while, but it was always something happening with me. So it was later on that I returned to school that was much, into the 70s. But it was something I was destined to do, yeah. But at that time, I bought into it. That was where I belonged. That was where I should be.
This revolution took away the stigma that it was not okay for women to be sexually active. Sex became casual, and people began to have more and more sexual partners.
Berkeley campus is a very lonely place. There's so many students and so many people who don't really have a friend at all. The alienation present in Berkeley is the cause of a lot of the sexual freedom, and you might take off for Berkeley to find the answers to life or something. When you divorce yourself from your past, your parents, you leave behind your standards. Here you are, free from those values, because no one's here to check up on you, and it's kind of the accepted thing to sleep around or do whatever you feel like. And I think a lot of people come here and they think, I'm free now, and I can do whatever I want to, and you see signs painted on little Volkswagen vans, sleep with someone you love, and people are looking for love. People are really looking for an end to their loneliness, and a lot of them go to sex to find it.
I would say for the girls in my nursing class, who I know well enough to talk about this, think that the new freedom to live openly with the boy you're not married to and have sexual relationships with him, and to be free of the fear of pregnancy because of the pill, they think it's one of the greatest things that have ever happened.
We feel there's been quite enough emphasis in our culture over the past 2,000 years on the dark, terrifying possibilities of sex. We've heard quite enough, thank you, about its terrors and its tyranny, about the disease and wrecked lives and tortured souls. All these centuries, almost everything the church has had to say about unmarried sex has been one thing: don't. And that just isn't enough anymore. People won't settle for that.
And it was at this time that our attitude towards sex began to change. This was the moment. You see, the way we are today is not just a natural, inevitable conclusion. The world was a certain way for millennia, thousands of years. And it is not to say that immorality did not exist, because, as I said earlier, that is far from the truth. But up until this period in time, this immorality was not mainstream in the public view. It was more hidden and in secret. The 70s was the decade that began to bring all this out in the open, and the influence was massive. The 70s brought sexual experimentation. It brought swingers, orgies, and nudists out into the main view. This was all from the influence of the hippies that I mentioned earlier. And you should know that this influence, it was not just in the streets, but as I have consistently shown, it was on the television as well. Like I showed in part 3 with the feminist movement, shows like Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, and That Girl, they already promoted the feminist movement. But in the 70s, these shows punted the ball to Mary Tyler Moore, and she took it away on the Mary Tyler Moore Show on CBS from 1970 to 1977. Moore portrayed Mary Richards, an unmarried, independent woman focused on her career as associate producer of a news show at the fictional local station WJM in Minneapolis. The show proved to be a groundbreaking series in the era of second-wave feminism, portraying a central female character who was neither married nor dependent on a man. She was a woman that was actively having sex.
Don't forget to take your pill. I won't.
The Mary Tyler Moore Show was extremely popular. It earned 29 Primetime Emmys, including Outstanding Comedy Series, 3 years in a row. Moore herself received the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series 3 times. This show had influence. All this was in the beginning of the 1970s. This was all in the start of that decade. There was a change in the culture. One major influence of that change came from what the Supreme Court did. In 1969, there was a case in Georgia where the police charged a man for owning pornographic movies. The case was Stanley v. Georgia, and it changed sexual culture in the United States. The Supreme Court ruled in that case that if anyone wants to read dirty books or look at dirty movies in the privacy of their own homes, it's none of the law's business. The court said that a person has every right to satisfy his intellectual and emotional needs in the privacy of his own home. And maybe you agree with that ruling. I mean, I do. The government should have nothing to do with what you do in your personal home. But you see, before this case, pornography was said to be something that was really undercover. In the late 50s and the early 60s, the Supreme Court continued to narrow the definition further and further of what it considered to be obscene. And so by the late 60s, you start to see books, magazines, and films that were sexually explicit. And so then, this system, the United States government, it portrayed like they were doing good and that they cared. They made an inquiry into it. President Johnson, the same one who signed the Civil Rights Act, he appointed a special commission to look into the problem of pornography and its impact on the American people. The United States Congress funded the President's Commission on Obscenity and Pornography to study pornography. Even after Nixon was elected, this commission kept on working. The commission's findings were published in 1970, and they recommended sex education. They, of course, found that there was no evidence to date that exposure to explicit sexual materials plays a significant role in the causation of delinquent or criminal behavior amongst youth or adults. They found that a majority of American adults believe that adults should be allowed to read or see any sexual materials they wish. And they felt that there was no evidence that exposure to explicit sexual materials adversely affects character or moral attitudes regarding sex and sexual conduct. President Nixon, who had succeeded Johnson in 1969, a Republican, he emphatically rejected the report, but by then the damage was done in the minds of the public. The view of pornography changed from being something obscene to something you can do and look at in private. And there becomes a major cultural shift with the availability of pornography. This is all happening in the 70s, all hitting the mainstream all at the same time. In 1972, pornography then came on the mainstream. It was spoken about and promoted to the masses. This pornographic film was released. This movie earned mainstream attention, drawing fashionable viewers such as Warren Beatty, Shirley MacLaine, Jack Nicholson, and Jacqueline Onassis. It launched some porno chic trend, but it still was the subject of obscenity trials, and it was banned in some jurisdictions. In various United States communities, the movie was shown to juries to determine whether it was obscene. The outcomes varied widely, and the movie was banned in numerous locations. In August of '72, after a jury in New York City had found the movie not to be obscene, prosecutors decided to charge Mature Enterprises, the company that owned the World Theater, for a promotion of obscene material, taking them to trial in December. During the trial, a psychiatrist testified that the film portrayed acts that were well within the bounds of normal behavior. A film critic testified the movie had social value because it showed sympathy for female desires, because the script contained humor, and because it was filmed with clarity and lack of grain. You see, this is all in the physical world, but this is what is not seen. This mainstream film released sexual demons into society that have never been contained since. How we are today is a direct result of these influences and the mainstream attention that was spread about it through the television. It got people talking about this movie. Without the television and its influence, the promotion of that movie would never have been accepted. But it was, and many people all around the country went and watched this horrible movie, getting sexual demons placed right into them. Sex became mainstream, and it began to be placed into our society. There were many influences that this sex came from, but no one bigger than the television. Like I explained about the Mary Tyler Moore Show, that was far from the only influence. I mean, there was a whole jiggle era of shows on television in the 70s. Certain shows would make sure that its lead actresses would appear in a bikini, one-piece swimsuit, negligee, underwear, or naked under a towel in each show. Shows from Charlie's Angels, Three's Company, and Wonder Woman showed women as sexual objects.
In the 1970s, the world was caught up in moral panic over the perceived rampant spread of pornography. In response, NBC executive Paul Klein coined the phrase jiggle television to describe the way many female television stars featured on his rival network, ABC's shows, were directed to move around suggestively, wearing loose clothing or in their underwear so that their breasts or buttocks could be seen shaking or jiggling. This marketing strategy Klein was criticizing was the brainchild of ABC television producer and executive Fred Silverman, best known for his work on shows like Charlie's Angels, All in the Family, The Waltons, and Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? The crude yet effective term jiggle TV was often used in the media to describe shows like Wonder Woman, Three's Company, and perhaps most famously Charlie's Angels. These programs were meant to appeal to young male viewers. They often featured plots that were blatantly sexist, full of innuendo and suggestive dialogue, and entirely unrealistic in nature. It became evident exploiting female sexuality was the network's primary aim. Around this time, ABC's target audience was viewers between 18 to 35. Another apt name that Jiggle TV received was TNA TV. Jiggle TV was taken to new extremes in the late 80s as well as into the early 2000s with shows such as She Spies, Baywatch, and countless offerings from the USA Network.
You see, it's hard to watch this content today and see it in this way, but this just goes to show you how tolerant we are due to just how much we have seen. Back during those days, this was not common, and there was a lot of criticism and pushback. Now, when looking back at it all, it's hard to know if the pushback and criticism was more about getting the attention of the audience so that they could view it more than it was about actual concern. A lot of times the mainstream just creates controversy just so they can get out attention to it. It's a form of marketing. For instance, during my generation, I remember distinctly, I would have never snuck and watched Jason Lyric if the news didn't tell me that Jada Pinkett was having sex in it. A 13-year-old boy like me, hearing that on the news, it was not getting me into the controversy. It advertised Jada Pinkett having sex. This is how they do. The point I'm trying to make and explain is that the sexualization of our culture that we have today did not just start as a mental shift that the general public had. There was a concerted effort to sexualize American society, and by the time I was born and went into middle school, these thoughts were all but normalized only a decade or two later. When we talk about sex before marriage, we can see that Satan infiltrated American society with this. Our society was infiltrated by Satan, and you can literally go back and look at the influence and see where it started. The mindsets that we were grown up under were not our own. They were placed there because of mental manipulation that was all about creating a level of tolerance to sin and rebellion. It started slowly, but over time this agenda continued to grow and take hold. Many of us were born after these times, and we just grew up around sin and tried our best to figure out how we could just fit in with it all. I mean, when you really think about the hypocrisy of our parents going to church and talking to us about Jesus, but allowing these mental mindsets to be a part of them, is ridiculous and a part of the problem. The thing is that the sexual revolution of the 70s wasn't even the only satanic influence of the 70s. There was much more. But being that the sexualization of our women is such a problem in our culture today, being that marriage is deemed as a failed institution that people no longer support, and casual sex is just as common as personal friendships, people don't care anymore. So this is what we need to talk about first. Sex is unfortunately part of our current culture, and for many of us, we don't know how it got here. Now you know. It was not by accident, it was a gradual progression. It started from the rise of television. And here's a hard-to-hear, underrepresented fact. We could see that these agendas affected the families of the Negro communities even more than they affected the white communities. The Negroes were going through a complete cultural shift during this time. What most people don't recognize, or maybe they just don't want to see, is that the civil rights agenda was the major event in the history of the Negro that signed their hearts over to American society. They sold their souls. They protested to be equal, but the only thing they were allowed to be equal partakers in was sin and rebellion against the Most High. Everything else they were not equal in. They're still fighting for equality today. They attached themselves to agendas and mindsets that they would never have been able to accept if they did not assimilate. Look at our communities today. Look at the statistics I showed earlier. These agendas affected the Negro community more than any other because while they were over-sexualizing us and uplifting our women, they were also limiting the access to jobs and employment for the Negro men. This time of the 70s was a big decade when the black men of the baby boomer generation began to fail and lose their confidence in their roles as men. And then they unfortunately later took advantage of our sisters who were now giving it up because society told these women it was uncool if you waited till marriage. The Negro community would not have attached to this immorality if it did not first tie itself to be equal with them. Then as society changed, they did as well, all for the worst, and they no longer protested for their souls, but for their economic opportunity to be a part of it. See, our morality was lost in the 70s, and the culture from movies and music was all a part of it as well. But no other influence was more powerful than the television, because everything that was happening was being broadcasted over the air and made mainstream by one device that had reached 95% of the families in the country. And so if you fast forward to today, what are the values of our younger generation? What do your children feel about sex and marriage? What do you feel about it? What comes first, your family or your career? What comes first in your relationships? What age did you lose your virginity? Do you still think your actions was the right decision? I'm not judging you, I'm just asking you to think. I am no better than you in any of these things from the past. I'm just wanting you to think about your actions. We have women today completely sexualized with their own porno sites doing OnlyFans. Most women stars are sexualized. They can't even come on television without being skimpy and scandalous and sexual. Sex sells is the model that has followed through the last 5 decades with no end in sight until we are now at a point where it's not just sex, but pure debauchery and filth. It's important that you understand why this has happened. This was not just about money. This was about a gradual cultural shift that leads to a view of tolerance. Satanism is not about the worship of Satan, but it's about the worship of yourself. And we have been accustomed to put our wants and our needs over the wants and needs of the Most High. We love ourselves more than we do the Most High, and we will be judged for it. You must know that these modern day values are not what we once held on to. We were not like this. It would be different if this was the normal way of life forever. If this was how people lived for centuries, it would be different. I mean, people did live like this, but it was not mainstream, and it was never right. You have to make the decision for yourself if you're going to be a victim of this mind control, or are you going to wake up and choose the Most High and His way. Sex is a major issue, and the reason why it's a problem is because it's always in our face. Our movies, our television, our music, our education even. The way our women dress, our whole culture, it's over-sexualized, and it's an entryway for other sin and rebellion. It produces and contributes to a lifestyle of sin, and that is exactly why the mind control of the 1970s introduced it to the masses. It is important that you get these thoughts and values in check because the world is heading towards judgment, and you are being called to repent and make the ways of the Most High your priority now. Marriage is a fundamental bond that Yah created. It says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. The word says, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers, Elohim will judge. That's Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. And He will. Best believe it. The word says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18. Yahusha even says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. That's Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 29. Heed that warning. There it is. Satan has made sure that he has promoted a culture to us that causes us to commit adultery and live in a state of lust that causes us to sin. it is important that you get a hold of yourself and understand the game that Satan is playing with us. Not only a hold of yourself, but most definitely get a hold of your children, because this younger generation, they do not care. This sexual agenda was intentional in order for us to be trapped in sin, for us to live a life of sin and can't even recognize how to get out of it. You want a recommendation on what to do about it? Turn it all off. Dramatically lower your tolerance to sex. When you see it, turn the channel, change the page, unfollow the people that promote it to you. To my fellas, don't get caught in lust by a beautiful, scantily dressed woman. Get a hold of yourself. And if you need to stay inside a while until you gain more self-control, do so. Luckily, we're coming into the winter months, so people should be a little bit more dressed if you're up north. But listen, don't go places where you know that these women will be dressed in the most provocative ways. And unfortunately, that's everywhere right now. Look at these women as a trap, and it will help you resist them. When you see them for the demonic influence that they actually represent, all the other stuff goes away and it gets old really quick. Also, check your algorithm and get that together. The more you click on a beautiful woman, the more it'll appear. Stop clicking on it and they'll stop sending it to you. And to my ladies, I don't actually know how y'all think, to be honest, so I can't give advice, but I can tell you that Satan has attacked you the same way he did Eve in the garden. You must not follow him. Your body and your looks are not assets. Please know and believe that this pretty girl thing is going away in a very short time when this world collapses. The strength of a family bond will prove more important than your black girl magic, or whatever it is. Again, just keeping it real with y'all, I don't know how to give advice because I'm not a woman. All I can say is that Yah created you to be a wondrous mate for another man, who unfortunately right now may not know he needs you or even know how to be the man for you. As we're all waking up, focus on Yah and focus on being what he has called you to be, and he will put the right man in your path and remove the bad ones. Stay away from all those bad boys, because they will lead you to hell. The right man probably is not in the places you expect him to be. Why? Because he's trying to be the right man. I know this for certain because I am raising sons of my own, and I talk to other young men through this ministry, and they're not in the places that you might expect other men to be. Stop going to the club, stop hanging around all these places. You might actually find them in the comment section of this video. They are out here. Don't miss them because you're mind controlled and influenced by Satan to love sexual immorality. That's just a word of advice. And be clear, that goes for the men too. The sexual revolution on the 70s was the movement that normalized sexual immorality and made it seem normal and harmless. And if you look objectively over the decades, you can see how wrong that mindset was and how bad allowing this movement to win has brought down the world. We don't expect the rest of the world to change at all, but there is a remnant that is preparing for Yah's kingdom, and this is who I'm talking to. And I can promise you that those who will be a part of Yah's kingdom will not tolerate and condone the influence of this movement. You, yourself, must make the decision to put the Most High as a priority and live according to His will and His standards. It's your only option if you want to see Him. We have more to discuss on the history of our mind control and how we got to where we are today. But this subject needed to be brought out so it can be fully understood how the world got the way it is. Please do not follow it down the path of this justified sin and rebellion. Satan has clearly infiltrated society and has come out into the light. Make sure, as one who is preparing for Yah's kingdom, you reject Satan fully and commit yourself to the ways and mindsets of the Most High. Flee from sexual immorality. Be blessed. Hallelujah. Praise Yah. Okay, thanks again for watching. If this has blessed you, please don't forget to like this and share this video with others. Please send this video to anyone that you know. It's great if we get the conversation started. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to this channel. Yah willing, I upload every Friday. Don't forget to follow this ministry on Facebook and Instagram, as well as on my website, truthunedited.com. If you no longer see this channel on this platform, please look for my videos on my website, truthunedited.com. Thanks for watching. I'm thankful for all of you. Thank you especially to those Yah has placed it on your hearts to give, and you have done so. Thank you and your assistance in carrying out this ministry every week. I thank you for your blessings and your prayers and your support. They truly support this ministry. Thank you for your obedience to Yah's call on your heart. Okay, thanks again for watching, everyone. I love you all.